It is a great honor to be with all of you. Wonderful to receive this Peace Bronze with the image of Gandhi, and also the financial support that will go directly to Democracy Now! To continue to build this grassroots global network. Democracy Now! Began 16 years ago as the only daily election show in public broadcasting in 1996, in the second election year of Bill Clinton. In 2001, we went on radio. We were on a few dozen community radio stations to start. Now, 16 years later, from a couple dozen community radio stations, Democracy Now! Airs daily on over 1,000 public radio and television stations around the country and around the world. I have just come to you from the United Nations, where I was speaking this afternoon on this World Press Freedom Day. And I was particularly moved to be there today because this past week, April 26th, was the 75th anniversary of the bombing of Guernica. You know, the Spanish town. And the reason that's so significant to the United Nations, I'll be going to Guernica in about a month when they have their observances, is in lead up to the invasion of Iraq in 2003. A tapestry hung in front of the UN Security Council. It was Pablo Picasso's painting of the Guernica, made into a tapestry. See, when Guernica was bombed under Franco, Pablo Picasso was enraged, and outside Paris in a 21-day frenzy, he painted the Guernica, the famous painting. The agony of war etched in the faces of the people and the animals. He said that the painting could never go back to Spain under Franco. So he had weavers make 3 tapestry reproductions, 30 feet long, I believe. And they would travel the world. And this one of those 3 has hung in front of the UN Security Council for decades. Now, in the lead up to the invasion of Iraq, it wasn't lost on the United Nations and the US officials, the irony of this famous anti-war backdrop against the pro-war pronouncements of the US. It was February 5th, 2003, that then Secretary of State General Colin Powell gave his final push for war, that speech that he has called a blot on his career. Once again, trying to convince the world that there were weapons of mass destruction, and he did a very good job. It was the final nail in the coffin for so many. A few weeks later, the United States would bomb Iraq. And so, as the US officials were making these pro-war pronouncements, the UN shrouded the tapestry with a blue curtain. It is our job to pull that curtain back, to show the realities of war. Could you imagine if for just 1 week we saw the images of war on a daily basis, right? Above the fold of every surviving newspaper, a photograph and a story. The top of every radio and television newscast, the video images and the narrative about what is taking place from Afghanistan to Yemen to Pakistan. If everyone on their Facebook wall referred to war, every tweet mentioned the fact that we are still at war, there's no more serious decision a country can make than to send its young and not so young people to kill and to be killed. Could you imagine if every email, every image we saw for a week was around war? I really do think, images of babies dead on the ground, soldiers dead and dying, women with their legs blown off by cluster bombs, or families killed by drones. I really do think Americans are a compassionate people. They would say no. War is not the answer to conflict in the 21st century. But they have to see. And that's our job in the media. The media has become so important, and yet it has been used as a weapon of war to cheerlead for what the state wants. My brother David and I wrote a few books, and one of them is called Static. And the reason we call it that is in this high-tech digital age with high-definition television and digital radio, still all we get is static. That veil of distortion and lies and misrepresentations and half-truths that obscure reality, when what we need the media to give us is the dictionary definition of static: criticism, opposition, unwanted interference. We need a media that covers power, not covers for power. We need a media that is the fourth estate, not for the state. And we need a media that covers the movements that create static and make history. And those movements, well, it's why it's so important that you all are here and that you are organized. You are part of groups that are working for peace. It's groups that make the difference. It's not about the man this year who will be president. It's about the movements. You know, going back to November 2008 and that historic election that saw the first African-American president of the United States, Barack Obama, in this land with a legacy of slavery. It was truly historic. And I think on that night, the world heaved a sigh of relief. For so long, people felt that they were hitting their heads against a brick wall. And I include Republicans and Democrats, independents, and people outside of the country, because it really matters who is president and what people do in this country to people outside the United States. I was once doing a show years ago on the elections. I was at WBAI in the studios then, and I had just finished having a conversation with a woman from Guyana, and the music came up, and I said, well, thanks so much for joining us for talking about the US elections now. And she said, yeah, I'm going to stay for that part of the conversation. I said, oh, you want to listen? She said, no, I want to be a part of it. I said, oh, but you're from Guyana. Why do you want to be a part of the discussion about the US elections? And so she said, I think everyone in the world should get to vote for president of the United States. That's what she said, because of the effect that that one job has. But it really is more about movements. I think everyone felt, many people felt they were beating their heads against a brick wall. That wall then became a door. The door was open a crack. The question is, would it be kicked open or slammed shut? And that is not up to that one person. That is up to all of you and people all over this country. You know, when President Obama is sitting in the Oval Office and those who are used to walking the hallowed halls of the West Wing whisper in his ear and are used to having the ear of the most powerful people and make their demands. If he can't point out the window of the Oval Office and say, if I do that, they will storm the Bastille. If there's no one out there, he's in big trouble. And that's when you agree with him. What about when you completely disagree, right? The community organizer-in-chief, Barack Obama, was an organizer on the south side of Chicago. I mean, the good thing is parents all over this country started saying to their kids, maybe you could be a community organizer too. But when the community organizer-in-chief became the commander-in-chief, who's going to do the community organizing? You know, let's remember what Frederick Douglass said, power concedes nothing without a demand. It never has, and it never will. And there is no question that the right has pounded on President Obama, and there is no question that he has heard what they have to say and responded and carved a kind of agenda that responded to those demands. You know, one of his first acts was to say he would close Guantanamo. He hasn't. On the issue of war, I do think that the reason Obama is president and not Hillary Clinton is the main difference between them was the Iraq War. He was against it. She had voted for it. That was they mainly were the same on every other issue. He became known as the anti-war president. And she would not say until the very end, when she saw she was losing, maybe I made a mistake. Maybe I made a mistake. So think about the movements that elected President Obama: the anti-war movement, the racial justice movement, the economic justice movement, the environmental movement, the lesbian and gay movement, and so many other movements were the ones that got him into the White House. I mean, but Guantanamo did not close. I was thinking about a time when I was invited on CNN before the Obamas entered the White House, but after he was elected, and they went to Washington to the White House, and they invited me on to comment, and they had a bunch of other pundits on. You know those pundits who you see on all of the networks, who know so little about so much, explaining the world to us and getting it so wrong. You deserve so much better than this. And don't forget, the airwaves are yours. They are a national treasure. They're the way we come to understand the world. If we don't know about a particular country or know someone from a country, we learn about it through the media. And it's the way the rest of the world comes to understand us. And that is why it is so important our image not be projected through a corporate lens. We need to build our own media. That's why Scott Harris is so important with his station, WPKN, why it's so important to have WBAI radio in New York, why it's also so important, and I hope everyone gets these flyers and passes them out to many others and adds PKN to the list. New Haven, West Haven, Hamden, Citizens Television, Channel 26, that airs Democracy Now! Every Monday through Friday at 11:30. Hartford Public Access TV, Channel 5, Monday through Friday at noon. WESU out of Middletown, out of Wesleyan, one of the oldest community radio stations in the country, 88.1, Monday through Friday at noon, runs Democracy Now! And has all of their own programming. Then, of course, the satellite networks as well, Dish Network, Free Speech TV, and Link TV, and on DirecTV as well, both those networks. Why these stations are so important. Democracy Now!, part of our mission is to weave together the different stations all over this country, a kind of patchwork quilt, where each patch, each square, is so important and reflects the community. That's the good kind of global media, that is not coming down from the top, but is bringing out the voices of people who are the experts in their own communities on issues that are often global issues, and that's who we turn to, not the know-nothing pundits. But there I was on CNN, and I saw the Obamas walking into the White House. This was for the first time. They would be moving in a few weeks. And the anchor was asking me about something else. I said, no, wait, we have to take pause. This is Barack Hussein Obama and Michelle LaVaughn Robinson Obama. You know, she is the descendant of slaves, which means their daughters, Malia and Sasha, are the descendants of slaves. And they are about to enter the White House and ultimately live there. The White House, which was built by slaves. Let's just pause. And it made me think about another house a few hours from the White House on the eastern shore of Maryland. You know, Frederick Douglass was born on the eastern shore of Maryland, and as a youth, he was enslaved. And it might not surprise you to know that he was a troublesome slave. And so it's handed over to a slave breaker named Ed Covey. His property was called Mount Misery. And Covey beat him, imprisoned him there on his plantation. But ultimately, Frederick Douglass fought back, escaped, headed north, and changed the world. When he came to New York through the harbor, he took refuge in the printing press of David Ruggles, who was a freed black man born in Connecticut, and had a printing press on Church Street. Now that printing press is an independent coffee shop. And I used to love to go there when Democracy Now! Was down in the Chinatown area near where the World Trade Center once stood. And on the outside of this old brick building of this coffee shop, it says David Ruggles sheltered Frederick Douglass here before he moved on to New Bedford. And you know, Frederick Douglass, the most famous abolitionist in this country, and the power of his voice was that he had been enslaved. He was speaking from his own experience. So that property where he was imprisoned by Ed Covey and beaten, tortured, though he escaped, Mount Misery, is owned today by Donald Rumsfeld. He bought it in 2003 to be near his close friend Dick Cheney, who lived down the street in St. Michael's. Donald Rumsfeld, Mount Misery. And I thought, this is so astounding. I have to really investigate if this is true. As a journalist, with my own eyes, though I read a lot about it, and I even started to talk about it, I have a real responsibility here. And so I headed down with my colleague, Dennis Moynihan, who I wrote the last book with, Breaking the Sound Barrier, to St. Michael's, Maryland. We drove in on a Sunday morning, and as we were driving in town, I said, oh my God, I have no idea where Donald Rumsfeld lives. I mean, how are we going to find this out? And then I saw an organic coffee shop ahead of us, and I thought, oh, they'll tell the truth. So we went inside, and they said, what would you like? And I said, well, I'd like to know where Donald Rumsfeld, the Secretary of Defense, lives. And they said, oh, just go out the back, drive down the road. You'll hit Mount Pleasant Road. Don't go down that road. Make a left, and then make a left and then a right, and you'll hit Mount Misery Road. Go to the end of it, and that's where he lives. So we get in the car, we don't go down Mount Pleasant, we make a left, and then we make a right, and we're driving down Mount Misery Road, and then we see at the end the darkened windows of the SUV of the Secret Service, and we know we've arrived. So I get out quickly with my video camera, and I'm filming, and I'm thinking, does Donald Rumsfeld know the significance of where he lives, Mount Misery? But sure enough, right there in the driveway is a stake in the ground that says Mount Misery. So the Secret Service, as I was zooming in, they were zooming out, so I had to get back in the car. And we had just passed an old, ancient black church, and we went inside, and the folks were having Sunday school in the sanctuary. And I went up to one of the women, and I said, excuse me, I was wondering if you could comment. I mean, this is such an historic area. You have Frederick Douglass born near here, enslaved at Mount Misery, tortured there, beaten, and now Mount Misery is owned by Donald Rumsfeld, who is known for torture. Could you comment on this? And she said, I can't comment right now. We're in church. So from Mount Misery to Mount Hope. I was speaking near Rochester, New York, and I told this story. And at the end of the talk, a young woman came up to me and said, would you come with me before you leave in the morning? I was flying out of Rochester Airport to Denver, to go to Mount Hope Cemetery, where Frederick Douglass is buried. I'd like to show you his grave. I said, oh my God, I'm flying out at like 6 in the morning. If you want to meet me at like 4:30 in front of the cemetery, big snowstorm. And she said yes, and there she was. And we slid over to this remarkable tombstone of Frederick Douglass. And then she had a twinkle in her eye and said, could I show you one more grave? I said, I really have to get, please. So we're running across the cemetery, sliding over the snow until we arrive at a smaller grave. It's the grave of Susan B. Anthony, who is buried next to her sister. You know, Susan B. Anthony and Frederick Douglass were not only allies, they were friends. Frederick Douglass was not only an abolitionist, he was a great feminist. He seconded the motion at the Seneca Falls Women's Rights Convention when many questioned whether women should have the right to vote. He seconded the motion. And Susan B. Anthony was not only a feminist and a suffragette, but she was also an abolitionist. And when I told the story at Wesleyan a little while ago, a woman came up to me after and said, and did you see the statue near Susan B. Anthony's house? Not of a general, but of Susan B. Anthony and Frederick Douglass having tea together. Anyway, that morning, I see this remarkable cemetery, and I race off to the airport, and I miss my plane. So I call up Dennis, and I say, oh my God, you've got to get me on the next flight. I was speaking in Denver that night, and he said, okay. He pulls up the blueprints of the airport online. He says, are you in the Susan B. Anthony wing or the Frederick Douglass wing? I said, no, this is no time to joke around. I got to get on the next flight. He said, I'm not kidding. And then I look, I'm standing in the middle of this airport, and there it says in the ground, Susan B. Anthony, and in the other terminal, it says Frederick Douglass. If you look carefully, you know, every once in a while, you've got to stop and smell the coffee. So I made it on the next plane to Denver. But you think about these movements and how important they are and what the equivalents are today and the difference that they made. The suffragist movement, the women's rights movement, the anti-slavery movement, the abolition movement, the civil rights movement. And let's just make our way forward, because it is extremely important to understand on whose shoulders Occupy stands today. I mean, make our way to the civil rights movement, to Rosa Parks. Now, why tell her story if I have a limited amount of time? Because she's a great woman, no question, but it's the one story that especially young people know, and older people, of course, know, but the media gets even that story wrong. Rosa Parks sits down on the bus December 1st, 1955, in Montgomery, Alabama, refusing to get up for a white passenger. And in so doing, she stands up for everyone. She is arrested, she is dragged off the bus, and she helps to launch the modern-day civil rights movement. That evening, Joanne Robinson, another activist, started to hand out flyers for a Montgomery bus boycott, and when Rosa went to court a few days later on December 5th, 1955, the Montgomery Improvement Association had their mass meeting, and they elected as their leader a young minister who had just come into town named Dr. Martin Luther King. Rosa Parks helped to launch Dr. Martin Luther King. So how does the media get it wrong? When she died a few years ago, there was a big memorial service in Washington, D.C. In Democracy Now! We raced down. She was the first African-American woman to lay in state in the Capitol Rotunda. They brought her body then to a Washington area church before the big funeral in Detroit. Thousands came out. There were big loudspeakers because so many people couldn't fit into the church. Inside, Oprah, Cicely Tyson, and others, but we were outside where it's often more interesting to be. And there were people listening. I went up to a young woman. I said, what are you doing here? She was a college freshman. And she said, oh, I emailed my professors this morning. I said, I won't be in class today. I'm going to get an education. If there are any students in the audience, don't say I said that. And the way the media got it wrong when they talked about Rosa Parks, they said she had done something remarkable. And they said what was so remarkable about Rosa Parks is she was just a tired seamstress. CNN said she was no troublemaker. But that's exactly what Rosa Parks was. She was a first-class troublemaker. She knew exactly what she was doing on December 1st, 1955. In fact, she had done it before. She was the secretary of the local NAACP. She worked under E.D. Nixon. He came out of radical labor politics, working with A. Philip Randolph to organize the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, the Union of Conductors on the Pullman trains. For starters, they were all called George. It's not what their mothers named them, all black conductors, of course. George for George Pullman. And that should give you an idea of just the beginning of what they needed to organize. And they brought in A. Philip Randolph, this legendary organizer, to do that work. And he organized them. He also helped to organize the 1963 March on Washington. And I was very moved to see that first image of Eleanor Roosevelt as one of the winners of this award, because I was speaking to Harry Belafonte a little while ago. And he told me the story of Eleanor talking to him. He said, you know, my dear friend Eleanor, and imagine being able to say that, and maybe there's someone here who can, since she actually did come to receive this award. He said, my dear friend Eleanor told me the story of taking A. Philip Randolph to meet with FDR when he was president, and after we had dinner, he talked to FDR about the condition of black people in this country, the condition of working people in this country, and FDR sat quietly. And then he said to A. Philip Randolph, I don't disagree with anything you have said, but you'll have to make me do it. Make me do it. Interestingly enough, when Senator Obama was running for president, and he was in the home of a New Jersey family, he was in the backyard addressing about 100 people as he was stumping around the country. At the end of the night, a person raised their hand and said, Senator Obama, what will you do about the Middle East? And he told the story of A. Philip Randolph meeting with FDR, and he concluded by saying to the questioner, make me do it, make me do it. I think that is the challenge of 2012. It is not about one man. It is about movements. That's what ultimately matters. It's about making those demands about issues you care about. One person in the White House cannot do this work and may not want to do that work. So whoever it is you vote for, that is one moment, one day of voting. What counts, and I think one problem with 2008 is people worked so hard that after President Obama was elected, they stepped back. My God, the work for that to happen. People were tired. And they also saw a serious right-wing, often racist backlash. They thought, I'm very critical of a number of the directions he is going in, but I don't want to contribute to that. I don't want to contribute to this kind of attack on him. But I do believe it serves no one, not Obama and not a democracy, when you don't stand up for what you believe in, no matter what the person in the White House does. You know, he is, no question, the President of the United States is the most powerful person on earth, but there is a force more powerful. And it is everyone here joined with people all over this country making demands about making this world a better place. See, the media denigrates activists. That's why they talked about Rosa Parks, not as an activist, but as a tired seamstress who did something remarkable. Rosa Parks knew just what she was doing. And not only had she been organizing with E.D. Nixon, the president of the NAACP, while she was secretary to change the racist laws of the South, she had trained at the Highlander Center. King had been there also, black and white together, working to make, to change America most strategically and effectively. She'd sat down on the bus before, as other young women had, refusing to get up. You never know when that magic moment will come. But when it does, if you've been involved in social change, you will have helped to build the foundation that will determine history, determine the future. And I think that's what's happening with Occupy today. I don't know if you could have predicted on September 17th that this moment, this group of people would take a square that would launch a revolution all over this country. But you can say that the work was going on way below the corporate media radar screen. But why Democracy Now! Is there to cover grassroots movements, following these movements all over. Now, of course, it didn't start with Occupy. The Arab Spring was what fueled what happened in Madison, Wisconsin, which fueled what happened in New York, and then fueled what happened all over the country. You had Mohamed Bouazizi, the Tunisian young person believed to have come out of university, had no opportunity, went to sell fruits and vegetables in the marketplace, and the authorities were harassing him, took his scale, he couldn't take it anymore, and he set himself on fire. He burned himself to death, and that was the flame that sparked the Tunisian revolution that saw Ben Ali out after decades. And then that fueled the Egyptian revolution, which was so remarkable. There was something else as well. Of course, number one was the people of Tunisia, but there was also WikiLeaks. We cannot underestimate what transparency and information does in a society, in the world. Now we see one young man has been held for more than a year, much of that time, in conditions that amounted to torture. Bradley Manning accused of releasing documents to WikiLeaks. and Julian Assange under siege in Britain, the founder of WikiLeaks. But what they did, what WikiLeaks did, and I don't include Bradley Manning in this because he has been accused, it is not clear exactly what he did. But you can be sure the US government is deeply concerned about him speaking to anyone, why they have kept him in isolation for so long at Quantico, stripped him naked, his personality disintegrating, because how can you stand that kind of pressure for so many months on end without trial, without charge until recently? But what WikiLeaks did, I was just talking about this on World Press Freedom Day, because it's very important. It's about pulling that blue curtain back. When they released the Afghan war documents, the Iraq war diaries, you know, these are the documents written by military, not by peace activists, though I think there are a lot of peace activists in the military, by the way, and the State Department. The documents, the cables, the largest trove of cables ever released in history. A lot came out. And let's just talk about what it would mean if it had come out at the time that it was written. One example, Iraq, February 2007, a document describing, written by a military officer, this Apache helicopter unit flying overhead, and these two men, Iraqis, put their hands up to the helicopter, trying to surrender. And the soldiers in the helicopter recognize it as that, and they call back to base because they don't know what to do. These guys are trying to surrender to a helicopter that's hovering above. And at the base, the lawyer responds and says, you can't surrender to a helicopter, so they blow them away. Now, all of you gasp, and you say, are you kidding? And I do believe that's what people across the political spectrum would have done if they knew that in 2007. I think there would have been a call for an inquiry. There may well have been a court-martial, an investigation, law laid down on how soldiers behave. But that didn't happen because we didn't know, and it wasn't going to come from the military itself. So 6 months later, July 12th, 2007, that's the video that WikiLeaks released called Collateral Murder. That's the video taken by that same Apache helicopter unit in an area of Baghdad called New Baghdad. The Apache helicopter is hovering overhead, and they see 12 men walking below. You hear the soldiers cursing, laughing. They are not rogue, just as the ones in February weren't. They call back to base. They are following orders, and they blow them away. 2 of those men below were a journalist and an employee of Reuters. The journalist was filming. His name was Namir Nur Eldin, 22-year-old up-and-coming videographer. And his driver, the fixer, Saeed Shema, 40 years old, beloved by the Reuters community. Fixers in a time of war are so much more than that. They are making connections, they are protecting you, they are driving you, and Saeed Shema had 4 children. So they opened fire on this group of men. They kill them all except for Saeed Shema. He's crawling away, though devastatingly injured. A white van pulls up from the neighborhood to help, and they blow the van away. There's 2 children in the van, and you're going to see all of the repercussions of this. Critically wounded, a little girl and a little boy, and men are killed as they were trying to pick up Saeed Shema to bring him into the van. Reuters tried to get the video that was taken by the Apache helicopter for years under the Freedom of Information Act. They couldn't get it, but WikiLeaks released it. I dare say Namir, Saeed, and these other men would be possibly alive today if, in fact, we'd seen what happened 6 months before. We must see the reality of war. You know, we told that story, we aired the video when it came out, and a little while later, Iraq Veterans Against the War were holding a march from, I think it was Arlington Cemetery to Walter Reed, or the other way around. And they were soldiers who'd returned or those who had resisted who were marching to say to President Obama, stop sending soldiers back to war with PTSD, with post-traumatic stress disorder. Stop. And we interviewed one of the soldiers who had served in Iraq, and I said to him, so can you talk a little about your own experience? He clearly was suffering terribly. And he said, well, I was with a unit on the ground. It was July 12th, 2007, and we had gone to this white van that had been blown up by an Apache helicopter above. And I took the children out of the van. And he said, their image was seared into my mind. He said, I went back to the base, I asked for help, and he said his supervisor told him to suck it up. And he says he just disintegrated from there on. And he was coming back to this country and decided to talk about his experience. I talked to another soldier who was in that unit but wasn't feeling well that day, so was back at base. And he described the soldiers coming back after they had done this. And he said, I don't get it. Why are you just focusing on this? So I said, well, I think it's a big deal. You know, 2 journalists were killed, and Iraqis were killed as well, 12 people altogether. These kids are critically wounded. You don't think that's a big deal? I said to the soldier, he said, well, of course it's a big deal, he said. But that's what we do every day. Why are you focusing on this one? Well, that is a very sad statement, and the sad fact is because we had the video. Show the pictures. Show the images. Going back to Rosa Parks to show how brave she was, 1955. Let's go back a few months earlier to the summer of 1955, the summer of Emmett Till, the 14-year-old African-American boy from Chicago, whose mother, Mamie Till, wanted him out of the city for the summer. And so she sent her only child to be with his aunt and uncle and cousins in Money, Mississippi. He was sleeping one night. He was dragged out of bed by a white mob, and he was essentially lynched. He was tortured, he was beaten, and he ended up in the bottom of the Tallahatchie River. This is the context in which, just a few months later, Rosa Parks was sitting down in the bus in another part of the South. She knew this story well. Brave, brave people. So there was Emmett Till on the bottom of the Tallahatchie River when his body was dredged up. His mother, Mamie Till, in Chicago, when his body was sent by train to Chicago, said she wanted the casket open for the wake and the funeral. She wanted the world to see the ravages of racism, the brutality of bigotry. Thousands of people streamed by Emmett Till's casket and saw his mutilated, distended head of this 14-year-old boy. And then Jet Magazine and other black publications took photographs, and they were actually published. And they were seared into the history and consciousness of this country. Mamie Till had something very important to teach the press of today. Show the pictures. Show the images. And so, moving to today, we go from the uprising in Tunisia to the uprising in Egypt, and why, if you are listeners or viewers of Democracy Now!, how many of you watch or listen to Democracy Now!? Well, that is beautiful to see, and if anyone didn't raise your hand, you've got this flyer to find out where you can watch, or just go to democracynow.org. The transcripts are there. You can watch the video again. You can listen to it on the radio. You can listen to it online. It's about bringing out the voices of people at the grassroots, and that's just what Sharif Abdel-Qaddous, our senior producer for 8 years at Democracy Now! Did when he flew home to Egypt, the son of one of the most famous writers of Egypt, Hassan Abdel-Qaddous. That is his grandfather. And he flew from New York basically into Tahrir, and those 18 days were also remote down the satellites, so the networks couldn't broadcast back. And the big corporate networks, you know, they use satellites. We use satellites when we can also. They're extremely expensive. You know, the networks gave Saddam Hussein millions of dollars to use his satellites. When we had Jeremy Scahill in Iraq, He and Jackie Sewin of Big Noise Films were going into internet cafes to defeat the firewall, the internet firewall that Saddam put up, by sending like 150 video emails to us, and we would, like putting it through a backdoor screen, and we would piece it back together in New York and broadcast these flawless broadcast quality reports. So though we will use satellite sometime, we also know how to do it really scrappy and cheap. We pioneered sending broadcast quality video through the internet. So when the thugs took the satellites down, Sharif and Hani Massoud, our videographer who was there too, also an Egyptian American, who can leap tall buildings in a single bound, we're sending these 20, 25-minute reports of people on the ground in Tahrir. When the networks, well, I remember seeing Anderson Cooper in his hotel room with a lower third that said, reporting from an undisclosed location. And there was Sharif in the middle of Tahrir saying, I am here, my name is Sharif Abdel-Quddus, and I am in the safest place in Egypt right now. And he became one of the top tweeters in the world, getting around the internet being down. He was being cited by CNN and MSNBC and Al Jazeera and all of the networks as he was getting information out. But it was the stories he was bringing you, not in his words, though his were eloquent, but in the words of so many of his fellow and sister Egyptians. You got to meet Adef Souef, the great Egyptian writer who wrote Map of Love. Nawal Saadawi, the 79-year-old feminist who ran for president, who was exiled, who was imprisoned under Nasser and under Mubarak, and she was there holding salons, telling young people, this moment will come. You met the young high school student who's publishing a broadsheet, Voices of Tahrir, in the shadow of the state media building that had spewed so many lies for so long. And when you hear this, you say, that could be my baby, my sister, my aunt, my uncle. That is the power of independent media, providing a forum for people to speak for themselves. You know, I come originally from Pacifica, first Pacifica station, KPFA in Berkeley, 1949, founded by a war resister in World War II. Lou Hill came out of the detention camp, said there's got to be a media outlet, not run by corporations that profit from war, but run by journalists and artists. That's how Pacifica was born. The first Pacifica station, KPFA in Berkeley in 49. George Gerbner, the founder of the Cultural Environment Movement, the former dean of the Annenberg School of Communications at the University of Pennsylvania, said, not run by corporations that have nothing to tell and everything to sell, that are raising our children today. We need an independent media, especially in this election year. In this election year brought to you by the corporations, beholden to the corporations, the weapons manufacturers. We are not, when we're covering war. The election's brought to you by the insurance industry and big pharma, when we're talking about this vital healthcare debate in this country and what we need. No, independent media is not brought to you by these vested interests. And then covering global warming. How critical it is that we're not brought to you by the oil and gas companies as the politicians in this country are. Not brought to you by the oil and gas and coal and nuclear companies, when we're talking about this critical issue of our day, from global warring to global warming. We were in Durban, South Africa in December, covering the UN Climate Change Summit. It's not that so much was happening inside the convention center there. It was what was happening outside, the tens of thousands of people, young and old, from all over the world, deeply concerned about the fate of the planet. That's what's amazing about these summits. And we were in Cancun before that, and Cochabamba before that last year, because there was a People Summit on climate change, and before that in Copenhagen, when President Obama flew in at the 11th hour and scuttled the entire agreement. Very interestingly, one of the people who was standing up, the most eloquent spokespeople for climate change, because of his own experience of his country, was the president of the Maldives, Mohammed Nasheed, who came and talked about his country that could disappear, could soon be submerged if we in the West did not change our ways. And he brought young people. He held a cabinet meeting underwater in the Maldives to demonstrate the point. In the last few months, he was overthrown in a coup d'etat. The military put a gun to his head, said he would kill him, his family, and his supporters. And Mohammad Nasheed could not accept this, countenance this, and he was forced to step down, to the horror of so many around the world, because he'd become a global spokesperson around the issue of climate change and the real casualties of climate change. He had worked at Copenhagen with the European countries, worked very closely. They would not accept this coup. Britain would not accept this. I mean, it was so obviously a coerced coup d'etat. And yet the United States, within hours, announced that they believed that it was a constitutional succession that had taken place. I'm not talking about under President Bush. I'm talking about under President Obama, to the shock of Mohammad Nasheed and the people of the Maldives and people all over the world. This threat around the issue of climate change, which challenges the oil companies and the gas companies, the richest corporations on earth, who give so much money in the elections to the Democrats and the Republicans. Yes, he would no longer be a thorn in the side, though I don't think he needs to be President Mohammad Nasheed, to be heard. We went to Durban, and I think it's particularly relevant today because that's where Mahatma Gandhi really conceived of Satyagraha 100 years ago, where he had his ashram, where he started to organize before he went back to India. And it was amazing to be there at one of the last hours of the conference when a young woman stood up at the plenary. She was invited and said, "You have been negotiating all of my life." That was Anjali Appadurai from College of the Atlantic in Bar Harbor, Maine, addressing the UN Climate Change Conference. And after she spoke and shamed the entire world body, she stepped away from the microphone in Occupy call and response style and chanted, "Equity now," and people shouted back, "Equity now." She said, "You've run out of excuses, you've run out of excuses." And the crowd shouted, "We're running out of time, we're running out of time." And she then put up her fist and said, "Get it done, get it done." That was Durban, South Africa. Quite remarkable what took place there, and being infused with Gandhi all there. But let's move then from Tunisia to Egypt to what happened in Madison, Wisconsin, the uprising against the governor who, once elected, though not promising this during the election, decided to go after the public unions, to eviscerate them. And what was amazing in Madison, and Democracy Now!, of course, broadcast from the Capitol Dome where so many people were sleeping and had taken over, is that the police and the firefighters sided with the teachers and the nurses. A very interesting and very different model from what we see with the Occupy movement, where they said, if you are targeting teachers and nurses, you're targeting us. It was quite amazing to see outside the governor's office kids with dreads drumming and police officers going, yeah, right next to them. The teachers and the nurses sleeping in the dome at night, and the police officers and the firefighters right there protecting them. A very interesting model. Some of the largest protests in the history of Wisconsin took place this past year. And to show how powerful that was and how historic, when we talk about the parallels from the past to the present, don't minimize just because you're there and perhaps a part of it. Oh, could this make a difference like the past has? As I stood looking out over 150,000 people in the Capitol grounds, freezing cold day, and saw the Museum of Labor History across the street. You know, AFSCME was founded in 1932 in Wisconsin, the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees. So was the John Birch Society, co-founded by, you know, the Koch brothers' father. David and Charles' father is Fred Koch, who co-founded the John Birch Society, which still exists there in Wisconsin. AFSCME. You know why Dr. King died. April 4th, 1968, in Memphis, Tennessee. He was standing with the sanitation workers who were simply trying to organize Local 1707 of AFSCME, of the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees. Yes, the trajectory of movement can be seen directly from then until now. And then we come to Occupy. We come to September 17th. Now, I remember at that time the number of people who were holding signs that said, "Too much doubt," and "I am Troy. I am Troy Davis." Because let's get the timing, if you remember who Troy Davis was. The timing was September 17th, 2011, when Zuccotti Park was taken over, and that launched this rolling revolution through the United States. September 21st, Troy Anthony Davis was scheduled to die at the death row prison in Jackson, Georgia. You know, the posters of Occupy are amazing, and they use the pizza boxes that are sent in, pizzas from pizzerias around the neighborhood. That was true in Madison, and it was true at Zuccotti Park. People all over the world would send in orders to send to Zuccotti Park. They called them Occupies. And then, because they were believing in sustainability, they were using every aspect, eating the pie and then using the boxes to make signs. And some of those signs said, I remember one of them, it said, oh, there was this freak snowstorm going to the issue of global warming. And they removed all the signs except one, "Hell, snow, we won't go." But then the posters that said things like, "I'll believe a corporation is a person when Texas executes one." Well, I'm talking Georgia right now, and I'm talking about Troy Anthony Davis. We raced down on September 20th and 21st to Georgia to be there to bear witness. If we could have been in the execution chamber, I do believe that these executions should be televised. Because I don't believe that people feel bloodlust. I believe people would be horrified. It's very important we understand what is done in our name. The best we could do is be outside the prison on the grounds. The prison authorities had set up a protest pen, and 150 people could be in that pen, and it filled up right away. And ultimately, it had the family of Troy Anthony Davis. It had the head of the NAACP, Ben Jealous, and the head of Amnesty International, many others. Outside, there were 1,000 people across the street. Students had marched from Spelman College and from Morehouse College from Atlanta to Jackson, about 40 minutes away. And we started our broadcast at 6 o'clock. We didn't know what would happen, because Troy Anthony Davis had 3 previous death warrants issued that were ultimately, some within minutes of him, the execution time, they drew back and they vacated the order. So we didn't know what would happen, but we wanted to be there. On September 21st at 7 p.m., Troy Anthony Davis was scheduled to die. We were awaiting news whether the Supreme Court would spare his life. I don't know how many of you know his story, and I'm going to be coming to a conclusion soon. But Davis was sentenced to death for the murder of the off-duty Savannah police officer Mark McPhail in 1989. McPhail was a hero cop. He was moonlighting as a security guard at a Burger King, I think, and a homeless man was being pistol whipped in the parking lot, and he went to his aid, and he was shot, and he was killed, Mark McPhail. The question was, who did it? The next day, a guy named Sylvester Red Coles walked into the police station, who was there that night, with his lawyer and said, Troy Anthony Davis did it, and fingered him. Okay, there was a trial. 7 of the 9 non-police witnesses later recanted or changed their testimony, some alleging police intimidation for their original false statements. One who did not recant, the 2 of the 9 who did not recant, was Sylvester Red Coles, who many have named as the actual killer of Mark McPhail. There was no physical evidence linking Troy Anthony Davis to the shooting. Troy Anthony Davis was one of more than 3,200 prisoners on death row in the United States. He faced 3 prior execution dates. With each one, global awareness grew. Amnesty took up his case, NAACP took up his case, the Pope took up his case, said he shouldn't die. Former FBI Director William Sessions took up his case, former Republican Georgia Congressmember Bob Barr. And all over the world, there were protests. And so this day went on. When we got to the prison, they handed us a press packet. Very thin press packet. One of the pages talked about his schedule, Troy's schedule for the day. Said he could meet with family from 9 to 3, but that at 3 o'clock they had to clear out because he had to get a physical. A physical? To see if he was healthy enough to be killed. You know what happened a while ago in Texas. A man who was on death row, about to be executed, attempted suicide. They raced him to the hospital. They got him better. They brought him back to the prison and executed him. So they were checking on Troy Davis. I went to the church just down the road from the prison where family had gathered, where ministers had gathered, the human rights leaders had gathered. The head of the NAACP in Georgia stood up. His name was Edward Dubose, and he said, the physical, so that they could make sure he's physically fit, so they can strap him down, so that they could put the murder juice in his arm. Make no mistake, they call it an execution, we call it murder, he said, and then sat down. And then another page of the very thin press packet that we got as journalists described what Troy would be having for dinner. And it went into great detail. It said grilled cheeseburgers, oven-browned potatoes, baked beans, coleslaw, cookies, and a great beverage. This is what he would be offered. He'd already turned down the special meal where you could choose anything. It also listed the lethal cocktail that would follow. Pentobarbital, it was a piece of paper like when you go to the optometrist or the ophthalmologist that you're reading the lines. 4 lines on this piece of paper in big letters. This is what we had in our press packet. Pentobarbital, pancuronium bromide, potassium chloride, and Ativan, in parentheses, a sedative. The pentobarbital anesthetizes. The pancuronium bromide let's see if I have the final pages. The pancuronium bromide, wait, let me get it right. The pentobarbital anesthetizes. The pancuronium bromide, what does that do? Muscle relaxant. The potassium chloride stops the heart. The sedative, the prisoner could decide whether or not he wanted to take it. The 2 things that Troy Davis had control over, the Last Supper and the sedative, he refused. And then we waited. The Supreme Court took up the case, but the point person on it was Clarence Thomas. Clarence Thomas came from Pinpoint, Georgia, not far from Savannah, where Troy had grown up. Pinpoint, Georgia, a community of freed slaves, and ultimately, well, we know the decision. At 10:53, they announced that Troy Anthony Davis, the Supreme Court would not stay the execution. Troy Anthony Davis was being injected with a lethal cocktail, and at 11:09, they announced he was dead. The body was then brought out and sent to Atlanta in an ambulance. The witnesses came out, and the reporters described what had happened inside. They said as he was strapped down and just before they injected Troy Davis, he was allowed to make a last statement. They open the curtains and he sees the observers. The family of Mark McPhail, he said, I am sorry for your loss. I did not kill your father, your brother, your husband. You should find out who did. I was not the shooter. He turned to his own lawyers and he said, please tell my family to keep up the fight. And he turned then to his executioners and said, God have mercy on your souls. God bless your souls. The ambulance took his body to Atlanta. His family was charged for the trip and listed on his death certificate, it said homicide. It was about 11:45 that we were continuing to broadcast, and the prison guards came out and they told us if we didn't stop the broadcast, they would pull the plug. The show was over. And as we neared midnight and I looked out on the prison and the guards, I could only think about what Mahatma Gandhi said when asked what he thought of Western civilization. He responded, "I think it would be a good idea." I just want to end back in the Egyptian revolution, the last days before Mubarak fell. Dennis and I were writing a column, our Breaking the Sound Barrier columns that we do every week. And we heard that a young Egyptian blogger named Karim Amr had disappeared once again. He'd already been in prison for 4 years under Mubarak, but he got out. He was at Tahrir. But then no one saw him. No one knew what had happened to him. So we went to his blog, and it was dedicated at the top to Hans and Sophie Scholl. I don't know how many of you know who Hans and Sophie Scholl is, but they were part of the White Rose Collective. They founded it in World War II with their professors and other workers and students. They were German Christians, not Jews, and they thought, what can we do in the face of the Nazi atrocity? And they decided they would put out a series of pamphlets, they were 6 in all, to let the Germans know, so that afterwards the Germans would never be able to say we didn't know. And they would drop them everywhere at great risk, in the middle of a fruit market in the middle of the night, or a courtyard, a schoolyard, in an alley, and they would get them distributed wherever they could. Well, the Gestapo found them. They got them, they charged them. The Nazis tried them, and they were convicted, and they were beheaded, Hans and her brother Sophie and their professor. On the 4th pamphlet was written the words, "We will not be silent. We will not be silent." I think that should be the Hippocratic oath of the media today. That should be the Hippocratic oath of us all today, especially in this year that is not just about an election in the United States, but an election that will make a difference in the rest of the world. And not just about this one day, but about the issues and the movements that you care deeply about, whether you will be able to push this country in that direction. Let us always remember those words. We will not be silent. Democracy Now!